The Pearl of Love by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Krista Zaleski. The Pearl of Love. The pearl is lovelier than the most brilliant of crystalline stones, the moralist declares, because it is made through the suffering of a living creature. About that I can say nothing, because I feel none of the fascination of pearls. Their cloudy luster moves me not at all. Nor can I decide for myself upon that age-long dispute whether the pearl of love is the cruelest of stories, or only a gracious fable of the immortality of beauty. Both the story and the controversy will be familiar to students of medieval Persian prose. The story is a short one, though the commentary upon it is a respectable part of the literature of that period. They have treated it as a poetic invention, and they have treated it as an allegory meaning this, that, or the other thing. Theologians have had their copious way with it, dealing with it particularly as concerning the restoration of the body after death, and it has been greatly used as a parable by those who write about aesthetics. And many have held it to be the statement of a fact, simply and baldly true. The story is laid in North India, which is the most fruitful soil for sublime love stories of all the lands in the world. It was in a country of sunshine and lakes and rich forests and hills and fertile valleys, and far away the great mountains hung in the sky, peaks, crests, and ridges of inaccessible and eternal snow. There was a young prince, lord of all the land, and he found a maiden of indescribable beauty and delightfulness, and he made her his queen and laid his heart at her feet. Love was theirs, full of joys and sweetness, full of hope, exquisite, brave, and marvelous love. Beyond anything you have ever dreamt of love. It was theirs for a year and a part of a year. And then suddenly, because of some venomous sting that came to her in a thicket, she died. She died, and for a while the prince was utterly prostrated. He was silent and motionless with grief. They feared he might kill himself, and he had neither sons nor brothers to succeed him. For 2 days and nights he lay upon his face, fasting across the foot of the couch which bore her calm and lovely body. Then he arose and ate, and went about very quietly like one who has taken a great resolution. He caused her body to be put in a coffin of lead mixed with silver, and for that he had an outer coffin made of the most precious scented woods wrought with gold. And about that there was to be a sarcophagus of alabaster, inlaid with precious stones. And while these things were being done, he spent his time for the most part by the pools, and in the garden houses and pavilions and groves, and in those chambers in the palace where they two had been most together, brooding upon her loveliness. He did not rend his garments, nor defile himself with ashes and sackcloth, as the custom was, for his love was too great for such extravagances. At last he came forth again among his counsellors, and before the people, and told them what he had a mind to do. He said he could never more touch a woman. He could never more think of them, and so he would find a seemly youth to adopt for his heir, and train him to his task, and that he would do his princely duties as became him, but that for the rest of it he would give himself with all his power and all his strength and all his wealth, all that he could command, to make a monument worthy of his incomparable, dear, lost mistress. A building it should be of perfect grace and beauty, more marvelous than any other building had ever been or could ever be, so that to the end of time it should be a wonder, and men would treasure it and speak of it and desire to see it, and come from all the lands of the earth to visit it, and recall the name and the memory of his queen. And this building, he said, was to be called the Pearl of Love. And this his counsellors and people permitted him to do, and so he did. Year followed year, and all the years he devoted himself to building and adorning the Pearl of Love. A great foundation was hewn out of the living rock in a place whence one seemed to be looking at the snowy wilderness of the great mountain across the valley of the world. Villages and hills there were, a winding river, and very far away 3 great cities. Here they put the sarcophagus of alabaster beneath a pavilion of cunning workmanship, and about it there were set pillars of strange and lovely stone, and wrought and fretted walls, and a great casket of masonry bearing a dome and pinnacles and cupolas, as exquisite as a jewel. At first the design of the Pearl of Love was less bold and subtle than it became later. At first it was smaller and more wrought and encrusted. There were many pierced screens and delicate clusters of rosy-hued pillars, and the sarcophagus lay like a child that sleeps among flowers. The first dome was covered with green tiles, framed and held together by silver. But this was taken away again because it seemed close, because it did not soar grandly enough for the broadening imagination of the prince. For by this time he was no longer the graceful youth who had loved the girl queen. He was now a man, grave and intent, wholly set upon the building of the pearl of love. With every year of effort he had learnt new possibilities in arch and wall and buttress. He had acquired greater power over the material he had to use, and he had learnt of 100 stones and hues and effects that he could never have thought of in the beginning. His sense of colour had grown finer and colder. He cared no more for the enamelled gold-lined brightness that had pleased him first, the brightness of an illuminated missal. He sought now for the blue colourings like the sky, and for the subtle hues of great distances, for recondite shadows and sudden broad floods of purple opalescence, and for grandeur and space. He wearied altogether of carvings and pictures and inlaid ornamentation, and all the little careful work of men. Those were pretty things, he said of his earlier decorations, and had them put aside into subordinate buildings, where they would not hamper his main design. Greater and greater grew his artistry. With awe and amazement the people saw the pearl of love sweeping up from its first beginnings to a superhuman breadth and height and magnificence. They did not know clearly what they had expected, but never had they expected so sublime a thing as this. Wonderful are the miracles, they whispered, that love can do, and all the women in the world, whatever the other loves they had, loved the prince for the splendour of his devotion. Through the middle of the building ran a great aisle, a vista, that the prince came to care for more and more. From the inner entrance of the building, he looked along the length of an immense pillared gallery, and across the central area from which the rose-hued columns had long since vanished, over the top of the pavilion under which lay the sarcophagus, through a marvellously designed opening, to the snowy wildernesses of the great mountain, the lord of all mountains, 200 miles away. The pillars and arches and buttresses and galleries soared and floated on either side, perfect yet unobtrusive, like great archangels waiting in the shadows about the presence of God. When men saw that austere beauty for the first time, they were exalted, and then they shivered and their hearts bowed down. Very often would the prince come to stand there and look at that vista, deeply moved and not yet fully satisfied. The pearl of love had still something for him to do, he felt, before his task was done. Always he would order some little alteration to be made, or some recent alteration to be put back again. And one day he said that the sarcophagus would be clearer and simpler without the pavilion, and after regarding it very steadfastly for a long time, he had the pavilion dismantled and removed. The next day he came and said nothing, and the next day, and the next. Then for 2 days he stayed away altogether. Then he returned, bringing with him an architect and 2 master craftsmen and a small retinue. All looked, standing together silently in a little group, amidst the serene vastness of their achievement. No trace of toil remained in its perfection. It was as if the god of nature's beauty had taken over their offspring to himself. Only one thing there was, to mar the absolute harmony. There was a certain disproportion about the sarcophagus. It had never been enlarged, and indeed, how could it have been enlarged, since the early days? It challenged the eye, it nicked the streaming lines. In that sarcophagus was the casket of lead and